This is Professor Tato coming at you with yet another lecture for History 1301. Here we're looking at a political revolution. And look at the Democratic Republicans now taking the reins after John Adams' Federalist fiasco, where we saw violations of the First Amendment and fights on the floor of Congress and congressmen being reelected from jail. All kinds of crazy stuff going on. So now we're going to see Thomas Jefferson taking office and see how he does things and how it compares to what was going on under the Federalist Party. We'll look at a little bit of context as usual, and then we'll examine an empire for liberty, which was, of course, Thomas Jefferson's vision for what's referred to as Jefferson's Revolution, which was all the changes he was making once he came into office. We'll also examine the Louisiana Purchase, which I refer to as an unbeatable offer from a tyrannical dictator. And then we'll see that toward the end of his second term in office, Jefferson was faced with the looming threat of war, and we'll see how he handled that. So we got to be aware that there's all kinds of issues that Jefferson, as a Democratic Republican, is now going to have to deal with that have bled over from Federalists and earlier administrations, both as part of Hamilton's economic plan during Washington's administration and the actions of the Federalist administration under John Adams. So remember, as part of Hamilton's economic plan, Hamilton had implemented this whiskey tax, which was very harmful to farmers. Remember, for Hamilton, that was a win-win because not only did it raise revenue to help out the federal government during their time of debt, which was the whole point of Hamilton's economic plan, but it also was very crippling to farmers who were the main support base of the Democratic Republican Party. Farmers, remember, grew the crops that were going into this liquor, things like corn and rye and potatoes, right, to make vodka and whiskey and all these distilled spirits that are being taxed. So now Thomas Jefferson, under the Democratic Republican Party, is going to have to decide how to handle this. He's also going to have to decide how to deal with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Remember, the Alien Act had targeted French immigrants as tensions had been building with France during that quasi war where the US and France were basically practicing state sanctioned piracy against each other. And then also remember that the Democratic Republicans had traditionally supported France and supported the revolution that was going on in France. And as a result, they were kind of pointed out as enemies, supporters of the U.S. as enemy, and therefore they were enemies by proxy. And the Federalists used that to justify passing the Sedition Acts. Remember, the Sedition Acts basically forbade anyone in the U.S. from having any speech or writing against members of the federal government, and it kind of specified just about every member of the federal government being protected under this act, except for the vice president. Reason for that was, remember, the vice president under John Adams was Thomas Jefferson, who was the head of the Democratic Republican Party. And it's pretty clear this was just a way to kind of try to silence the Democratic Republican Party. And we did, of course, see another example of several Democratic Republicans who were targeted under the Sedition Act when we looked at the case of Matthew Lyon. Matthew Lyon, remember, had no charges brought against him for all the crazy altercations he had on the floor of Congress, whether it was spitting on Roger Griswold or having a fight with him, coming at him with some fire tongs as he got beat with a stick. None of that was a big deal. What got Matthew Lyon into trouble was his violation of the Sedition Act. When he wrote as a journalist, he wrote a criticism of President Adams. That was what got him thrown in jail, remember. And remember, people opposed this act so much, they re-elected Matthew Lyon from jail. That's all recapping. But this is all stuff that Jefferson's going to have to deal with now that he's in office. And with this one, he very easily could say, well, you know what? I can use this now against the Federalists. You guys tried to silence me. Now that I'm in power, I'm going to use these laws to silence you. Or he could say, well, there's a lot of opposition to these. These are very unconstitutional and unethical. Maybe I'll overthrow these. We'll see what he does. Also, got to keep in mind this French Revolution is going to take a play into U.S. politics as it has been up to this point. Remember, the Democratic Republicans supported France and supported the French in their revolution, whereas the Federalists tended to oppose this. Remember, we had that very extensive overview of the French Revolution where there was a monarchy and then some people got their heads cut off and the monarchy got overthrown. Then there was a short-term republic, but then more people got their heads cut off, and then there was an empire established under Napoleon Bonaparte. I know that is the most complex overview of the French Revolution you could possibly imagine. I say very sarcastically. But as this revolution is playing out, we also need to remember that Britain had declared war on France, right? They declared war on these French revolutionaries because they were afraid that if nobody made an example of them, that their ideas might start to spread throughout Europe, and people in other parts of Europe might start to think, well, all we got to do is cut off some people's heads and overthrow our monarchy. Why not? That'll give us more liberty. So Britain wanted to kind of make an example of France and instill some order by declaring war on the revolutionary government of France. Okay. That's something also that's going to be splitting the U.S. apart politically. Remember, the Democratic Republicans, again, as I suggested multiple times, are in support of France in this revolution. The Federalists, by contrast, had a good deal of allegiance to Britain, all right, because they heavily emphasized order and they thought Britain was a great model for government. So that's going to further kind of drive their conflict. We want to see how Jefferson deals with that now that he's in office. We also need to remember is this election of 1800 that brought Jefferson to office. This was a very revolutionary election in many ways, and this is kind of what gives birth to this concept of Jefferson's first presidency being a revolution. So remember that this was not only the first tied election in U.S. history, and it could have easily gone south for that reason, but this was the first peaceful transfer of power where one party or faction is having to give power over to their rival party or faction. And again, as I suggested in the last lecture, at several points in world history up to this point, and really even moving forward, when these types of situations occur, especially in an early young nation like the U.S., this is prime time for there to be some kind of political coup or a violent overthrow of government so that one of these factions can solidify control. But everybody kind of agreed from both parties and both factions to utilize the system at play that they had come up with under the U.S. Constitution. And remember, that system was to take this vote to the House of Representatives and allow them to hold a special election. They were largely influenced, remember, by Hamilton, who spoke out against Aaron Burr, who had tied with Thomas Jefferson. They were both Democratic Republicans, but Hamilton said that Burr was kind of the most unfit person in the nation to become the president, while Jefferson perhaps had a pretension to be a good man, right? He had a little possibility of being a good man. So he kind of convinced the House to vote for Jefferson. Already we're seeing some revolutionary things at play there, okay? This is really the spark of Thomas Jefferson's revolution, as historians refer to it. And when I'm talking about a revolution, we don't have to confine that, of course, to a political overthrow in the violent or militaristic sense. As we visited during our lecture in which we reflected on the American Revolution and considered how revolutionary it was, a revolution really just means a complete change, a fundamental change in political organization. Especially an overthrow or renunciation of one government or ruler by another or carried out by the governed, but not necessarily always in a violent sense. Okay, this election, this transfer of power is pretty revolutionary. It's showing that this republic is working and that even rival factions who are being voted out of power are agreeing to it. And even two people within the same party who are tied with each other are kind of following through with the system. Now, of course, that's not meaning that everybody is hunky-dory and happy about it. We did see that Hamilton and Burr had a duel over this, and Hamilton got killed. But overall, this is showing a pretty revolutionary political moment to the world, really, where there's this functioning republic. And furthermore, Thomas Jefferson is really going to revolutionize the nation politically and make a lot of changes to what had already been implemented by the time he came into office. So let's take a look at the components of Jefferson's revolution. Okay, what is he envisioning here as part of what he considers to be an empire for liberty? One thing he definitely wanted to do and did do as part of his revolution was shifted the nation's emphasis from order to liberty. Remember, the Federalists' primary political value had been order. He's now shifting it away from that over toward liberty. He's furthermore shifting away from the Federalist emphasis on elitism and having a partnership between government and the wealthy. He's going to emphasize more for the common man. Well, there's going to be limitations on both of these, of course. There's going to be limitations on who all gets liberty and what type of common men we're talking about. A little more on that moving forward. He's also going to place a strong emphasis on agrarianism. Okay, he considered farmers to be ideal members of the American Republic for a few different reasons. He saw that they valued hard work, first of all, which was just a valiant characteristic to have. That's kind of something you want people in your nation to have. Furthermore, if they're working on the land itself, the physical ground of the nation, that's giving them a sense of attachment and investment to the nation itself in a physical sense. That's also going to make people more likely to be able to and willing to defend the nation if it ever came under attack. All right. Um, People are going to be a lot more likely and a lot more willing to defend what they consider to be their home. It's something that they put their blood, sweat, and tears into, than they are to defend the claims of some king somewhere. Furthermore, this could help support foreign alliances with other nations because these farmers could sell their crops to other countries, which again could be very beneficial for the US. But there were some constraints, of course, on this empire for liberty. In addition to calling for things like expansion and removal of Native Americans in order to get more land for the US to promote things like this agrarianism and to promote things like the self sufficient family farms that he wanted to see most Americans have, there were some great restrictions to liberty for African Americans, right? Because slavery certainly played a key role in this empire for liberty. Remember, we've already visited in an earlier lecture Jefferson's views on slavery, but they're quite complex and they changed throughout his lifetime. So, in his early life, despite enslaving hundreds of people, he kind of wrote against slavery in a moral sense. He seemed to be opposed to slavery. But then by the middle of his life, he started referring to slavery as what he considered having a wolf by the ears. Remember that metaphor, wolf by the ears, kind of refers to having this big growling rabid wolf in your face, and the only thing stopping it from biting you is you're holding it by the ears. Now, that's a very unpleasant situation for you and for the wolf, and he's suggesting that's the kind of situation that the nation is in as they're practicing slavery. It's a necessary evil. He's suggesting that if they let it go right away, it's going to cause some problems, okay? So just like if you let that wolf go by the ears, it's going to bite you. He's suggesting if we can put an immediate end to slavery, that could lead to things like those who had been enslaved revolting against those who had enslaved them, or it could leave them in a situation where they're kind of stuck and don't know what to do because they become so dependent on their enslavers. So his argument there is that it's a necessary evil. But then by the later years of his life, he shifted a little more in support of slavery and started to use concepts of paternalism, which we talked about before, to consider slavery like a positive good. And this got him to start talking about this theory of diffusion, which is basically spreading slavery throughout the nation and having it in as many parts of the nation as possible. His goal here was to reduce the likelihood of enslaved rebellions. Okay, so he suggested if slavery was dispersed throughout the nation and kind of concentrated in certain areas, that would make it more likely for there to be rebellions because there wasn't as firm of an institution keeping order against enslaved people. And furthermore, enslaved people may have incentive to say, well, if I can escape from this territory where they're enslaving me, I may be able to find somewhere where I can find a sense of freedom. Now, of course, we know under the Fugitive Slave Act that's not supposed to legally happen, but it's still a possibility, Jefferson's arguing, that could very easily be avoided if we expand slavery throughout the nation. So he clearly supported slavery, and it clearly had a key role in his empire for liberty. We also need to remember the case of Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings, remember, was the African American woman who was enslaved by the Jefferson family, and she lived with Jefferson's family at Monticello, which was his estate. And she bore some mixed children who were, DNA shows us, descended from a Jefferson heir, from a Jefferson male, rather. Her bedroom was right next to Thomas Jefferson's bedroom in Monticello, and records show us that whenever her children were born, about 9 months before, then we can see records of Thomas Jefferson having been at Monticello, all roads kind of pointing to him being the father of her children. He also ended up freeing her children later down the road. All this really just points to Jefferson having had some kind of sexual relations with Sally Hemings. And some people may suggest, to defend Jefferson's honor, well, it could have been a consensual relationship. And I think I've kind of gotten into this topic before, that if a person's being enslaved, is there really a level of consent there? There's some kind of power dynamics at play that I would suggest tend to make consent not really something that can happen there. Perhaps sense of Stockholm syndrome, but not true consent. So there's sexual assault, it seems very likely, practiced against this woman here by Jefferson on multiple occasions. How does all this fit in with the vision of liberty? But this kind of forces us to grapple with the complexity of history. So I'd like you guys to consider here, how much do Jefferson's views on slavery and some of the constraints placed here on liberty diminish his other successes and foundational accomplishments? Okay, there's a reason we all know the name Thomas Jefferson, right? That we've probably heard again about this guy since we were in elementary school. We know that he was the primary author, for example, of the Declaration of Independence, and that he put onto paper these ideals of there being things like natural rights that all people are born with and all men being created equal. Now, of course, from his perspective, he's seeing all white men as created equal and certain individuals being white men once again having these apparently universal natural rights, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That are kind of, if they're universal, everybody has them. But should we allow these kind of limitations and these constraints and these contradictions that we see to diminish his other successes? And I'm certainly not asking you to consider considering what he did here okay by any means. I don't expect anybody to consider whether something like rape or enslavement should be considered okay. I'd like to think that all of us in an educated group of individuals in the 21st century realize that those things fundamentally are just not okay on some level. What I'm asking is, does that completely disqualify his other successes? Okay, should we, for example, say, well, the concept of all people being created equal only applied to white men, therefore it really didn't have a whole lot of meaning? Or can we say that, as several people have in generations moving forward, we can come to look past that shortcoming and see that all men created equal was kind of a basis of seeing all mankind created equal, that we can see it from that sense and use that to see that natural rights are something that should be given to all people. And this kind of is the basis of much bigger questions. Okay, we can ask this about the majority of historical actors and events that we encounter in this class. So, for example, during the lecture on colonial Massachusetts, you'd seen a video of a Native American man talking about a historian, that is, Native American man who's a historian, talking about the first Thanksgiving, right? And talking about some of the ugly legacies of colonial settler relations with Native Americans, and how we need to be careful to not let our ideas of pilgrims and Indians meeting so peacefully overshadow all of those things. Yet he also says that he sees Thanksgiving on a separate level as a kind of beautiful holiday that he does celebrate, right? He enjoys the traditions that you would expect people to have with his family and friends. So again, can we maybe apply that same kind of concept here to Jefferson and to other individuals and other concepts that we encounter throughout the class? Can we perhaps see that there is both the negative and the positive, and not allow one to just completely overrule the other? Now, again, I'm not talking about letting this go. I'm not talking about saying that this doesn't matter because there were some good things. This is certainly something that we do need to be realistic about and educate each other about. I'm just suggesting perhaps could we maybe see, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you have a different perspective on this. Maybe you believe Jefferson should be not memorialized in a positive light, that we should only see him in the dark light due to these things here. Okay, and there's a fair argument to be made on that end as well. But these are just the kind of things you need to consider as you go through studying history. And you can also see a lot of this at play in the present day as well, okay, as we encounter individuals and situations in the present day where it comes to light that there are questionable aspects to this person's life or to their past, etc. Does that completely discredit everything about that person? Should they be silenced? Should they be shut down? Should they be canceled, per se? I'm just going to leave that open there, but I'd like you guys to consider these things as we move forward in the class and as you move forward in your life, okay? Moving on. Another part of Jefferson's revolution was overturning Federalist laws, okay? So he decided to just completely overturn the whiskey tax, which had been hurting his fellow farmers. He also overturned the Alien and Sedition Acts. In addition to helping his political party, this gained him a good deal of political support. Remember, these laws had been very unpopular. Matthew Lyon, who had been arrested for violating the Sedition Acts, was reelected from jail. That's a pretty clear demonstration of how unpopular these laws were. And here comes a Jefferson overturning them. That earned him a good deal of popularity. He also, though, tried to revolutionize the federal government in the sense that he tried to shrink government power. Remember, with his emphasis on liberty and individual rights, kind of based on these ideas of the consent of the governed, borrowed from John Locke, the Democratic Republicans believed in having a limited central government. And that was clearly demonstrated in Jefferson's protests that we saw before to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, that is. Remember, in these resolutions that he wrote with James Madison, they were arguing that the central government's power came directly from the states, that it was only because the states had ratified the Constitution that central government even had any power. So therefore, he very clearly is giving the notion there that states should be the ones to have the power and the central government should be very small or limited. And he saw to that, okay? He cut down the size of the federal government by shutting down several departments, and he also cut a lot of government spending. He also managed to, by doing so, significantly reduce the federal debt, for a while at least. We'll see how that maybe gets interrupted by some other things that happened a little later in his presidency. Hold that thought. Another aspect of Jefferson's revolution that was part of his vision here, this empire for liberty, was revolutionizing the army. So he wanted to shrink the army. Again, he's kind of skeptical of having an army that's too big and powerful because it may abuse its powers and become tyrannical and limit liberty for individuals. But he did see the army as something practical, okay? So he, on one hand, reduced the size of both the army and the navy, but he wanted to have an army that was more professional and better trained, even if it was smaller. All right. The army was going to be crucial to his empire of liberty. Remember, the empire of liberty, as you should have learned by now from the video that you should have reviewed for your reading video quiz, as the historian Eric Foner suggested it, it's this vision of creating an American empire where there is expansion of American territory, it claims over more lands, but it's not an empire in the traditional sense where there's colonies established who are paying tribute to the mother country. Instead, Jefferson's looking to have new territory added on as states with the same rights as all the other states. So he certainly is interested, though, in expansion, right? Whether or not he wants states or colonies, he wants states, as we know. This all is going to require expansion. And if the U.S. is going to expand into territories where it hasn't settled before, they're really going to need an army. That army is going to be very essential, not only for things like making roads and bridges and kind of paving the path toward expansion, but we've also got to remember they're not expanding out into an unpopulated wilderness. This is the homeland of indigenous peoples, many of whom have been living here for centuries, and some of whom have more recently been pushed over into this area as the U.S. expands west. That's, by the way, something we're going to continue to see as we move forward with our class is the U.S. will continue to move more and more and more into prime farmland, and in turn, indigenous people will continue to be pushed further and further and further west. 1302, you'll see how that kind of really led to some serious problems for both the U.S. and indigenous peoples. But the point I'm getting at here is the army is very clearly crucial to Jefferson's empire of liberty he wants to create, but he does still want to reduce the army, just make it more professional. And to help make it more professional, he supported the establishment of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, which is the military college. This would have promoted a more disciplined army, so where he could have a smaller army, but still have them disciplined enough to lead his ventures of expansion here. This also gave him potential to train Democratic Republican officers. Now, as you should have read for one of your readings for the reading video quiz, there was a bit of fear that Jefferson might come into power and overthrow all the traditional Federalist officers. But as you read, he kept a lot of them in power, right? And he's just adding some fresh blood to the mix here and giving some Democratic Republicans the opportunity to become officers as well. All right, another major part of this revolution, though, was the Louisiana Purchase. So to understand the Louisiana Purchase, we need to kind of trace back this territory known as Louisiana. Remember, Louisiana originally had been this large, expensive territory that spanned from about the Appalachian Mountains over here in the east to the Rocky Mountains in the west. But then at the end of the 7 Years' War, that had been split between Spain and Britain. France, remember, was kicked out of North America and they split their old territory along the Mississippi River. Britain then, of course, ceded their half of the territory to the United States after the American Revolution. But Spain held on to this territory here and they called it Louisiana. And how did France get it back? This is something that always kind of confused me when I was in school because it didn't always get explained. So you'd see that during the 7 Years' War, France got kicked out of North America and Spain took over this territory. But then later on, you hear about Jefferson buying the Louisiana territory from France. So wait, I thought France was gone. Well, a little step that often gets overlooked is France wound up reclaiming this territory from Spain. And they did so very simply by having Napoleon come in and say he wanted that territory. All right. Napoleon said, give us that territory back. Spain kind of said, well, we're not really in any shape to oppose you, Napoleon. We've already struggled long enough to even populate and administer this territory. It's a lot more than we can handle. So very clearly, we're not going to be able to resist you if you want to come in and take it by force. And Napoleon had, by the way, by this point, proven that he was quite capable of doing things by force. He'd been leading campaigns around the world. So when he came and told Spain, give me this territory back, they just handed it right back over to the French. So the whole point I want us to understand, that's a very long-winded way of saying, by the early 1800s, this territory now known as Louisiana, which spanned from about the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, was controlled by France under Napoleon Bonaparte. This caused some problems for the U.S. Remember, the U.S. had issues with Spain when they had control of the Louisiana territory in terms of having access to New Orleans. And they had settled those disputes they had with Spain in Pinckney's Treaty, where Spain had allowed the U.S. access to that port city of New Orleans. Well, now that France had taken over the Louisiana territory, that treaty kind of didn't mean a whole lot. So here's New Orleans here in the territory, now controlled by France. And the U.S. said, this is a real pain. What's the point of going and negotiating with France and getting it from them? Why do we have to keep negotiating and negotiating and negotiating? Why don't we just buy the damn city? All right. So Jefferson sent some emissaries to offer France $10 million to buy the city of New Orleans. I, of course, never care that you know specific numbers like that, but it's just kind of funny to see how this all plays out. So they're offering $10 million for the city of New Orleans alone. And Napoleon initially refused, okay, because let's take a look here at New Orleans, right here above the Gulf of Mexico. Right south of the Gulf of Mexico here is the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean, there's an island called Haiti, all right, which was a French colony. And when the U.S. first proposed to buy New Orleans from France, that colony, that French colony of Haiti, had been in rebellion. Okay, there were some enslaved people in Haiti who had started a rebellion and were overthrowing their French colonizers. So Napoleon's argument was that he needed access to New Orleans here so that he could send ships and supplies down to Haiti to try to fight off these rebels here in the Haitian Revolution. But Jefferson decided he wanted to try again a little later down the road. He said, look, guys, go maybe offer him a little more money, do what you got to do, bargain it, get us the city of New Orleans. And when these emissaries met with Napoleon, he offered them at that point the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. Again, I don't care, the specific numbers. We can see at first he's saying, no, I'm not going to sell you this whole territory for $10 million. But then later he's saying for just $5 million more, you can have the whole shebang. You can have all the Louisiana territory. So what caused him to change his mind? Well, the Haitian Revolution had played out against France's favor. The rebels were successful in the revolution. Now, some historians will argue that a mosquito won the Haitian Revolution because the French colonizers, especially the people coming over from France to Haiti for the first time, were suffering from malaria because the mosquitoes there were spreading malaria to them and they were all dying off and they just couldn't take it and they decided to give up Haiti. I kind of appreciate the irony there, but I think that theory robs the Haitian rebels a bit of their agency, the revolutionaries of their agency. That's a pretty phenomenal experience for enslaved people to overthrow their colonial government and establish an independent republic. Regardless, because that revolution was successful and France had lost that very valuable colony of Haiti, Napoleon no longer really had any use for keeping the not only New Orleans, but the Louisiana territory. Furthermore, we got to remember that at this time he was at war with Britain. Well, that war was kind of heating up and getting very expensive. So by selling the Louisiana Territory, that gave him a nice chunk of change that he could invest in his war against Britain. Okay. This was an offer that Jefferson couldn't refuse. All right. An unbeatable offer from a tyrannical dictator, and Jefferson took it. We need to understand this practically doubled the size of the United States. This also was very beneficial, I could say, to Jefferson's vision that he has here for creating this empire of liberty. There's now all this potential farmland where people can move out and establish the kind of independent farms he's wanting to see. Problem is, the U.S. hadn't really had any time in this territory. They didn't know what was where, who was where. They didn't really know the terrain, the geography, how to navigate this area. So they sent an expedition known as the Corps of Discovery, led by two explorers named Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to go out and explore this Louisiana territory, and to get a feel for it, get a lay of the land. Remember, though, this territory they're going into is not an unpopulated wilderness. It's populated by indigenous peoples who have been there in some cases for centuries. So they're not really discovering a whole lot despite their name there. This Corps of Discovery was very dependent on support from a woman named Sacagawea. Sacagawea was a Shoshone woman who was married to a French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau. And Sacagawea acted as a guide and diplomat for the Corps of Discovery, leading them throughout this Louisiana territory, kind of showing them around, showing them where they could get water, where it was safe to travel through, where they maybe wanted to avoid it because there may be some hostile people nearby, where they might want to send their army to when they come back with them later. And she did all this with a newborn little baby on her back, okay, traveling through the countryside with a little baby on her back. This all clearly demonstrated U.S. dependence on indigenous people as they expanded into the territory. All right, they're depending very heavily on Sacagawea, basically for survival, let alone to get a lay of the land. This is something we keep seeing, right? We've seen it with Doña Marina, we saw it with Squanto, we saw it in the Dominguez and Escalante expedition. And the reason I keep kind of bringing this point up and driving it home is it speaks to a bigger picture, okay? This helps us kind of see past the sometimes presented narrative that Europeans and then later Americans came in and just conquered all these Native Americans who just felt like flies at the hand of their superior civilizations. This shows us that they were still there. They were a part of it all. They played key roles in this history throughout the process. All right. And while there is certainly some tremendous devastation that Native Americans have had to endure throughout U.S. history, it's a total fallacy to make the assumption that they all collapsed at the hand of anybody's civilization. There are still indigenous peoples among us. Indigenous culture is still present in certain regards. And to deny that is to rob indigenous peoples of much deserved agency and to fail to recognize them as very, very key players who are central to American history. So many people saw this purchase of the Louisiana Territory as a major achievement for the U.S. Not everyone, though. Federalists were pretty annoyed about this, and they made that clear. So their argument was, well, whenever we tried to do anything that wasn't strictly written in the Constitution, all you Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson would come and tell us how we need to be more of strict constructionists. And whenever we suggested that maybe there were implied powers in the Constitution and that we could interpret it loosely, you guys claiming to be strict constructionists would come over and say, oh, no, you can't do that. If it's not written word for word in the Constitution, you can't do it. Yet here we've looked over the Constitution several times, and we don't see anywhere in there that it says that a president of the United States can go purchasing land from a dictator, okay? That's not a right you have per the Constitution. Therefore, you are having to interpret the Constitution loosely in order to make this purchase, all right? You're very clearly using some implied powers to make this Louisiana purchase. That's pretty hypocritical of you for criticizing us for doing the same thing. Does that only apply when we're the ones interpreting it that way? And they gave him a lot of for this. But during his second term, as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson started to deal with some problems with Great Britain. So remember, France and Britain were at war, and we'd already seen that while the U.S. tried to remain neutral in this war, they're kind of getting involved in one way or another without even wanting to. So remember, for example, after the U.S. had made Jay's Treaty with the British, the French, just as the Spanish had, suggested that there must have been some kind of secret deal under the table because the treaty was so dumb. And as a result, they started engaging in impressing U.S. ships and attacking and looting U.S. ships. And that led to the Quasi War. Well, now Britain's going to start doing the same thing because now they're really upset with the U.S. for providing this money to France in exchange for the Louisiana Purchase. Okay. They see this as the U.S. providing their enemy with support. So now they're going to start impressing U.S. ships and attacking U.S. ships out of the open seas, which remember they had already been doing before. Then under Jay's Treaty, they agreed to stop. Well, they're saying now that you're supporting our enemies, backseas on Jay's Treaty. This, I think, understandably had a lot of the public pretty upset, especially a clear example of this impressment known as the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. So, in this event, there were some sailors aboard this U.S. ship called the USS Chesapeake that was attacked by a British ship, the Leopard. And the British sailors on the Leopard impressed some of the U.S. sailors, forced them to come join their crew. And this all happened right off the coast of Virginia, where people could see all this happening. There were also some sailors killed in this assault, and it's just a very kind of disturbing thing for the people in Virginia on the coastline to watch. Okay, the American people are seeing firsthand the impacts of allowing the British to get away with this. And this led to widespread calls for war. Right? This Chesapeake Leopard affair led to widespread calls for war. Gee, that sounds significant. So people are basically saying we can't just let Britain be getting away with these kinds of things. We got to do something about this. So Jefferson found himself having all kinds of pressure to go to war, not only from common American citizens who were upset by these kinds of things, but also by other politicians. Okay, so there was a sect, for example, of congressmen, primarily Southern congressmen known as war hawks, led by individuals like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, who were both senators in Congress, who started calling on Jefferson to go to war. But Jefferson knew that going to war with Britain would require building up a much larger navy, building up a much stronger army, using a lot of government funding to administer this war. And that would really be counteractive to all the things he'd been working on throughout his revolution during his presidency, right? So he was very hesitant to go to war. It got to a point though where he knew he had to do something. So what he tried to do is he tried to put economic pressure on both Britain and France by passing a series of acts referred to as the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act. And these banned trade with nations like Britain and France. So his first measure was to try to ban trade with any nations at war. But that was really difficult for the U.S. to get through. So he said, okay, let's just limit it down to Britain and France and they'll get the picture. Again, passing these kinds of acts restricting trade is perhaps again showing some contradictions in Jefferson's policies, though, right? He's no longer using strict construction here. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the U.S. president can pass this federal ban on trading with a certain nation, right? But this is an effort he's making to try to put economic pressure on Britain and France to try to get them to stop fighting. The results, though, were kind of counterintuitive. This really made no impact on Britain or on France. Very minimal impact, we could say. They were doing just fine trading with other nations. The U.S., by contrast, as a young nation, had grown very dependent on trade with Britain and France. So basically, this is kind of like Jefferson shooting himself in the foot and wanting Britain and France to feel the pain. All right. This did not work out for the U.S., and this led to the U.S. falling into tremendous debt. That, as you might imagine, along with Jefferson's unwillingness to go to war while the public and certain politicians were calling for him to do so, led him to lose a good deal of popularity. So by the end of his second term, Jefferson made the smart move and he decided to go the way of George Washington and say, I have had enough. 2 terms is enough. I'm going to go ahead and retire. And he backed on down and let some fresh blood come deal with the problems that had been stirred up during his administration. He was succeeded in office by another Democratic Republican, James Madison. All right. And we're going to have to see now how the Madison administration responds to this pressure to go to war. I'm going to wrap this up here, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, that is it for now. Over and out.